Hello, everyone. How's it going?
Hello, Ben.
So, I'm very excited to be here. It's excellent stuff there. If I fall asleep during the presentation, it's because I just traveled about 25 to 30 hours solid to get here. If you saw me hanging around outside yesterday, I was the one that looked a little bit like a zombie. So if I do fall asleep, please do feel free to shout at me, because that'll then hopefully wake me up again. So yes, I want to talk to you about DevOps and legacy code bases. Who here has managed in the past a legacy code base? Who has enjoyed the experience? All the hands, oh, no, maybe half a hand, kind of enjoyed the experience. It's not often a fun job. And I wanted to come here and share not only my experiences, but I did some research into how other companies have addressed the issue of managing legacy code bases and how DevOps could have helped them and has helped in some of those cases. And I want to share those with you. So a bit about me to start with. I've been a software engineer for way too long. I used to put the number of years up there, and then that started making me feel old. So I just put the date that I started. So I first started in ASP.VB. Does anybody remember enjoying ASP.VB? No, nor do I. I very quickly found out about PHP, and I was a PHP developer for about 10 years. Talk about legacy applications. It's a bit of a joke. PHP is still good. PHP 3, probably not so much. In that time, I was also a business analyst and a solutions architect. I was doing security consulting when I worked in Melbourne, Australia, and I would work with different small businesses to try and overcome their internal tech issues. Often that would include legacy code bases, which was a lot of fun to handle. I love the developer and open source communities, so that's why I love coming to do things like this. So please do catch up with me afterwards and have a chat about this or other things as well. And I've always been really passionate about security and privacy. That's probably one of the underlying things of most of my talks. As mentioned, I now work as a developer advocate for Sonar. So if you've used Sonar Cloud, Sonar Cube, any of those, you can talk to me about those afterwards if you like, but you don't have to. And I am on this newfangled social media app called X. I don't know if you've heard of it. Ben Dechrai, my DMs are open. If you want to get in touch with me, that's probably the easiest way. I'm also on Blue Sky. Less often, I check that there. If you're not on Blue Sky and you want an invite, come and chat to me. I can give you one of those too as well. But anyway, enough about that. Let's actually move on to what legacy code bases are. Anybody in here a PHP developer? Or ever done any PHP? First of all, it's 3 hands, and so suddenly everybody's like, you know what? I think I can admit to this. I think it's a safe space. Welcome, it is safe. I started there. I'm not going to judge you. I don't do it anymore. If you still do it, I'm also not going to judge you. But you might remember seeing code like this. This is actually not that badly written. But if you are a PHP developer, you'll probably realize that nowadays we don't actually use the same class name in the constructor. We also don't, in probably most applications, use the direct connection to a database. You probably use a data access object of some sort, and at the very least, you want to abstract that away. And also, it's probably a really bad idea to hard code things like host names and passwords. And so this is like, it feels a little bit icky. We will probably want to make this nicer. That's a good example of what legacy code base might look like. It's going to make your life harder, especially when all the code, thousands and thousands of lines of code are like that. Maybe you're more of a JavaScript developer. Again, no judgment. But if you are, you might have a look at this and go, OK, well, so var I should be let, right? It's let nowadays. So var I get day of month. Oh, there's J. I don't know what the J stands for. Really hard to read. But then if I is greater than 31, then set it to -1. Should never happen, right? But if you remove that code, somebody tried at some point to remove the code and it broke the application, so they put it back in, and a warning comment. Isn't that fun? So we're not going to touch that bit of code, because we don't want to break the application. What about if we move on to, my clicker really doesn't want to play games today. What about if we move on to something slightly more complicated? So Byron here is very intelligent, as you can tell. He can write very complicated regular expressions. So he's done that, and he's wrapped it all up in this password strength function, and you can call that from somewhere. You can pass something in. Apparently it's going to work some things out. But he is so clever that he doesn't want you to change his code. If you think there's something wrong, you should speak to Byron first. That's what he told us 15 years ago when he worked at this company. And then 4 years ago, somebody thought, well, Byron doesn't work here anymore. He left a while ago. So we have these kind of legacy issues as well, right? Where the developer has written something that you may or may not understand, you may or may not want to actually change. But in any case, that single source of dependency on a person is never going to be scalable or sustainable. As I'm going through these, I'm looking around your faces, and I can see some of you going, oh, yeah. And I can see some of you going, oh. So for those of you who are doing the latter, I feel you. It doesn't even have to be code, though. Imagine you pulling down a repository because you've been asked to have a look and make some changes, and there's a README MD file in there, and it says, OK, you want to develop locally? OK, first thing you've got to do is download the database from Dropbox. Right, that's a good reaction, thank you. So you download the database from Dropbox. I don't know, is it an SQL file? Is it a binary? Who knows? But you then need to install MySQL. But don't forget to enable magic quotes on the API application. And if you're a PHP developer, you will also be cringing, feeling sick in your stomach. Magic quotes, for those of you who don't know, was a way that PHP would automatically escape strings before it went into things like database queries. Can you imagine where that might go wrong when your language is actually modifying strings for you without you knowing? That's good fun. Also, this only works on Windows 7. Perfect. So I thought, OK, we've got a good idea of what legacy codebase is. We can laugh about it. It is fun. But things like this do actually exist in the wild, and we do have to deal with these kind of things. But what are the actual implications of managing legacy codebases? And I thought there's one person. Not a person. There's one entity in this world who knows the answer to this better than anybody. Can anybody tell me who that was? I can hear people whispering ChatGPT. Find a case study that describes the depth of issues that can arise from managing legacy code. Surely ChatGPT knows. Well, ChatGPT does, and it actually found a case study by CoolLeaf. I don't know what they do. It doesn't actually matter what they do. Software is software. It does something. Some of it's legacy and some of it isn't. But they do have a logo of a leaf, and it does look kind of cool. So that works. So they basically went through and they decided, what kind of things are we going to face when we migrate this application? And they said, look, we know that pretty much every single application in the world is going to face this issue of legacy code. The only time that an application cannot face legacy code issues is when it's new. But any application that's been around for a sufficient amount of time is going to have legacy issues. So one thing we know is it's going to slow down the project development. The team working there might not even be there. Remember Byron, who left 10 years ago? So teams move on, and this institutional knowledge kind of shifts, and you don't actually know what's going on under the hood. Technology and practices have become outdated or obsolete. Again, that PHP 5 example before. Over time, the app evolves in an undesired way, getting bigger and scarier, and that's very true. We do see, especially these legacy applications are more monolithic in nature often. At least they're the ones that are harder to deal with. And finally, you end up with a monster app that becomes difficult to handle. So when they identified that these were all the issues that they were facing, they came up with a very Shakespearean, no, actually, I translated it into Shakespearean. They came up with basically the decision we've all had to make. To refactor or not to refactor, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of burdensome rewrites or take arms against the sea of legacy bugs and by cleaning end them. It's a question we all have to answer. Ideally, not in Shakespearean English. So, essentially what they worked out is that refactoring legacy code is going to be extremely time-consuming, and you may end up with an app unfit for release for months or 7 years. Now, I actually take a little bit of an exception to this statement. They say that refactoring code is extremely time-consuming. It is, but it doesn't have to be done in one go, right? So as I was looking through this, I was thinking, are they actually implementing a rewrite in the best way possible? There are many ways of doing it, and maybe for them, I don't know their exact situation. All I read was their report on how they did it. They wanted to help the community as well. You might end up with an app that's unfit, but ideally when you're doing this kind of rewrite, you're seeing along the way whether or not you're going in the right direction. So hopefully it'll still be fit for purpose. But one thing they did work out is that over the application's life cycle, they had made many good ideas. They also had some really bad ones. And again, this is what legacy apps are about, right? There are lots of decisions that were made in the past that, in Byron's case, we have no idea why he made that decision. And in some cases, like the documentation, it just hasn't been updated. It might not actually reflect the truth. Maybe it works on more than just Windows 7 now, but it didn't back then. So it's always hard to know whether what you're looking at is accurate. And also, you're going to end up with lots of dead code. How many times have you looked through files of functions and you're like, why is my IDE telling me this function is never called? So we've got lots of dead code issues, we've got lots of duplicated code issues, but the thing is that even with that dead code and the duplicated code, your application still works. So do you actually need to fix it? Well, for maintainability purposes and for adding new stuff in the future and for keeping up with the latest trends in technology and for not having to run Windows 7 anymore, yeah, you're probably going to have to make some changes. So they decided to come up with some core principles. First one was that they wrote it in Ruby on Rails, and they decided we're not going to add any more gems. They had identified they had a lot of dependencies, and they didn't like that. So they decided they weren't going to add any more gems. They decided they were going to redesign the architecture, and then they realized they didn't have an architecture, so they decided they were going to design the architecture. They were going to split the app into many. And this is a really good option if that's open to you, and we'll talk about that in a bit as well, about breaking it down into smaller chunks. Their plan was to remove all the unused code, clean the remaining code, do a repositories concept, and by this I think they were probably talking about repositories pattern, and then to use kind of like an abstraction layers, which is a little bit like the repositories pattern in terms of so repositories pattern, if you're not aware, is the way you handle data in your application. It's like a data access object, but it's a bit more specific about the way the data is actually used, so you can overlay more, I guess, business logic type stuff on top of that. But that's not actually that relevant to this talk, so I'll stop going there at a tangent. But what's missing from this, as I broke it down? I did actually, by the way, include the link there if anyone wants to look at their actual article that I've taken these bits of information from. But the thing that I found that was missing in the way they were talking about this was any sense of automating this. It seemed to be a very manual process. They were going to go through and manually get rid of all the dead code and then clean up the code. But they did actually say in the article that the most important thing is to provide the highest possible test coverage in order to test the changes immediately. And this is a really good idea when you're doing any kind of development, as I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but especially when you're looking at legacy code, because oftentimes you don't know what's going on under the hood. You might not understand the code. It might be so abstracted that it doesn't actually make sense, and you might be rewriting some parts of it as you, rather than copying the code over completely. And you want to make sure that it's still doing the same. And they had identified they didn't have enough testing. So testing is something that was important to them, but they didn't really call out the automation directly. So in analyzing what they wrote up, I thought, I don't actually know their code. I don't know all of their decisions, like I mentioned. It's just having looked at their public report about what they'd done. But I did wonder to myself, why are they cleaning all of the code to make it all readable? If we look at this is actually the source code for Sonar Cube. And if you have a look, we had 0.4 of a million lines of code back when we first wrote the application. And if you follow that red, I think it's red, orange or whatever, if you follow that down to 2022, 0.0 something lines of code that were originally written 13 years ago still exist in that code base. Just in the last year, you can see that a lot of the code that was written in 2016 is now gone. So is it really worthwhile cleaning all of the code if you're probably not going to change it? Talking about changing code, maybe you can just do clean as you code. So as you make changes to a legacy application, you can just clean that little bit of information. And here's another interesting one. This is actually from GitHub's, I forget the name of the project, but if you're interested, come ask me afterwards when I can look it up. But they basically have analyzed a whole lot of code and how much of it changes. So you can see right at the beginning, none of the code has changed because it's new. And over time, the amount of code that existed at the beginning of the project keeps dropping. And after 5 years, only 37% of the old code is still in your application. So let's say you clean all of your code, and then 5 years later, 63% of that code is gone, and it hasn't been touched. probably not actually worthwhile spending that time cleaning in the first place. You could save yourself 67% of your time and speed that process up at the beginning and get straight on to the actual migration part. And then I also wondered a lot about the aspects of the bottleneck caused by one person. They did say that going to a repository approach or the repository pattern would have to be done by one person. And essentially, like I said, the repository pattern is a different way of looking at data. So you are changing the underlying application quite heavily to use that data in different ways. But you can still do that in a modular process over time. You don't have to do it as a one big change. So not entirely sure why they chose to go that way. It could be because they were a small team. They did mention in the report that there were only a handful of developers, so maybe they didn't have enough developers to actually put multiple people onto that. And then, as I mentioned before, this is my tumbleweed automation. They hardly mentioned it. I believe they probably would have done more, but they didn't really mention it. So I thought, OK, we've got a good idea of how to identify legacy code and what kind of things you might want to change about it. Let's have a look at two side-by-side comparisons of organizations that have actually used a DevOps approach to modifying their code. So I went with Nationwide Building Society, they're a bank in the UK, and the United States Department of Agriculture, which is a department in the United States, and they like agriculture. That's kind of in the name. So I want to see where's DevOps played a pivotal role in existing migrations. So these slides are going to be very content-heavy, but I'm going to take you through step by step because I wanted to do that kind of a comparison. And it's interesting to see where the differences are. So to start with, Nationwide realized they had, and these are the challenges they faced. So what were they trying to solve? They had slow release cycles. I think we can probably all identify with that. USDA also identified that they had slow release cycles. They couldn't respond to emerging challenges, whereas Nationwide wants to send updates out to customers quickly. So you can see already that the why is different, but the challenge they faced is still similar. Nationwide wanted to reduce their high operational costs. USDA wanted to change their maintenance costs. This is an interesting one. So they still want to save cost, but in terms of Nationwide, it's like, how much does it cost to maintain legacy code? Whereas USDA wants to make the maintenance easier. If I can make an assumption, which I'm about to do, I imagine what's happening here is that Nationwide are a bank, right? What they want to do is they want to make sure their application scales, they want to make sure that they can innovate, and that's one of the points they mention in a second. USDA is a government organization, and they're more interested in, they might have legacy applications that they can't completely migrate. They might be dependent on some of those old things. So what they want to do is to make sure that the maintenance of those existing applications is not going to keep skyrocketing. So again, the why is different, but the underlying challenge is still there. They both were concerned about scalability. Interestingly, Nationwide, being a bank, wants to help customer to end, whereas the USDA, being a government department, wanted to adopt to changes in whatever it is that they're interested in this case, fields and tractors. They both wanted to know about Nationwide, interestingly, USDA didn't specify this in their whatever. They didn't mention the security aspect of it. Banks are very interested in security compliance, whereas USDA was more interested in how they can use all the data they're gathering and use it in a more useful way across departments, because all of their information was siloed. So they used DevOps in order to transform their applications. They both found that automating build testing and deployment was a good idea, so they both did that. They both saw that CI/CD would allow more frequent and reliable releases, so they both did that. Interestingly, USDA decided that CI/CD was going to be their ability to reduce manual errors and deployment times, whereas Nationwide attributed that to the automation part of it. But I guess they're both part of the same thing, right? Real-time monitoring, a big part of DevOps that is often in the dev app world, not spoken about often enough. But Nationwide wants to make improvements to their application because they provide a service to end users, whereas the USDA wants to make improvements to system reliability because their end users are very different. Their end users apparently are fields and tractors. Nationwide were very interested in security and compliance. and as were USDA. But again, the difference there is that the bank was interested in compliance, USDA was interested in fixing vulnerabilities. Different whys, same purpose. And they both realized that there was obviously the whole DevOps thing, bringing teams together and everybody's happy, kumbaya, sit around a fire and roast some marshmallows and we're all happy. And we understand what's going on left to right and we can address issues faster. So those are obviously good things. But interestingly, again, there's the differences here. Nationwide were interested in breaking down into microservices. They saw this as a great way to scale. Whereas the USDA was looking more as infrastructure as code. I'm pretty sure Nationwide use infrastructure as code. I mean, why wouldn't they? But it wasn't a key outcome for them. Whereas for the USDA, it was. So what were the actual results? They reduced release cycles, and they could roll out features faster. Again, same for both. Reduced operational costs and reduced maintenance costs. Again, I talked about why I think that is, but it's interesting to see how different organizations look at the value and what value that brings to them or to their customers. They scaled individual components independently. This is going to the microservices that they were really excited about. So they didn't have to scale everything up, they could just scale where the demand was. Whereas USDA were very interested in scaling up systems and down to accommodate the programs. That was more on a whole scale perspective. They both enjoyed improved application security. USDA wanted fewer breaches, and the bank wanted regulatory compliance. And increased customer satisfaction and innovation was important to the bank, whereas the USDA, better data integration and better communication within teams was more important. So it's fun to see how these different aspects are important to different kinds of customers. So, with the last few minutes I have, I just want to go through the kind of considerations you might want if you've got a legacy application that you need to maintain and how DevOps can help. So, first thing you need to do is play the Choose Your Own Adventure game. Are you going to refactor or rewrite? A lot of these are going to be very similar, but there'll be some things in the rewrite that are different to the refactor, insofar as a rewrite is essentially starting a brand new project that does the same thing as the old one. So it's like starting a brand new project that doesn't have an old version, right? You've got things you've got to align to. But essentially, automating feedback, testing, clean code, vulnerability scanning, security auditing. If you haven't spoken to them already, we've got 3 sponsors outside who do exactly that. So now I have 3 products that will help you with that as well. There you go. Using containers for all technologies. So a lot of these things are things we do on new projects anyway, but I don't want to set up a Windows 7 machine, so I'm going to containerize that. I want to be able to build and destroy the application within minutes because I'm probably going to break something because it's a legacy application. And if I can roll back without having actually to manually roll back, and I can just be like, you know what, destroy it and rebuild, much easier as a developer. And it helps both new applications and existing applications, making it possible to develop from anywhere is really useful. Using containers for scaling, I've already mentioned that in one case, you might just want to scale horizontally, but that the bank nationwide found it really advantageous to be able to scale at a microservice level. They might need to add some more API endpoints and databases, but the web app might have been fine. Use orchestration for reliability. Again, this is definitely preaching to the choir. You would do this for a new project as well as an old project. But basically, we're making it easier to onboard people to get into the application and speed up the deployment into testing and production and get all of that stuff. Oh yeah, ease of rollback. That's always fun. The most important thing that I think is useful from a developer perspective, and this is from my perspective of having been a developer and a solutions architect, and not so much from the DevOps perspective. As a developer, I really love integrations that a lot of these toolings will bring into my IDE. I want immediate feedback as soon as I get things. And automating things through a CI/CD pipeline is great because I can look at that report, but if I can get that pushed directly into my IDE while I'm developing, even if it's a cloud-based check of some sort, that's really valuable. So again, we're benefiting from shift left. We know all of this already. We can use the tools to monitor the new code quality, see whether or not the changes we're making are actually going to pass muster. And we get the results right to the desktop, like I say. The last thing I want you to think about is as you're developing, and this is not really so much of a DevOps thing, but more of a great way of determining whether or not the migration option that you're going through is working, is to deploy both applications and run them in tandem. you know that the old application is going to give you the right information. You don't know that the new one does, but you do know that the new one is the code you want to run. So you automate all the deployments. That's great. Put an API gateway in to, or just a web gateway, really, to proxy those requests and log to detect anomalies. And by that I mean, if you've got a request that comes in, and you send it to a load balancer, and you send it both to the old application and the new application, you can then send the known good response back to the user, or whatever, and you can log the two results, and if they differ, you know there's a bug. And on that gem, I'd like to thank you for your time. I think I went a couple of minutes over, so I don't know if I've got time for questions. But thanks for your time. I hope it's been useful to you. If you want to talk to me more about this in the break as well, do come and have a chat with me. I'd love to talk more about your migration woes. Thanks.